Hello, my friends on YouTube, and welcome back for another episode. This one labeled number 8, The Role of Grief, as it pertains to anxiety and depression. This may not be something that you would have initially thought of as a contributing factor. Certainly it does with stress and so forth, but in Western society, grief is frequently, or almost always, associated with the loss of a loved one. So what we don't really see is that grief is partly that, but the key phrase here is it's a loss in such a manner that it is something close to your heart, something you value, someone you value, a relationship that's no longer there, a loss of employment, financial security, a dream, as in my case. Now, grief in and of itself is a natural process that we go through as human beings. It produces an enormous amount of stress in our lives, a vacuum, if you will, in our social activities, potentially. And most of us feel that, or at least are aware of, your typical grieving process that you go through after a death, like say in the family. And it takes months to go through it. Let me tell you something from my past over the last decade or so, and maybe this will give you some benefit. When my anxiety and depression began peaking about a dozen to 10 years ago, I made radical changes in my life because I always felt it was the stressed environment that I was in that was driving this. And if I remove myself from that, then particularly on the anxiety side, it would go back down to where it used to be. Well, it didn't. And I kept doing this over and over. I left a very high pressure job, which I could handle, but it was my boss and her demeaning manner of managing me as well as my staff that I just couldn't put up with anymore. There was a situation with my marital situation, which I also was very unhappy with, and between feeling inadequate at work and then coming home and feeling criticized for not doing enough with the children, and they weren't in bed in time, and there was never a happy look on her face or a kind word to be spoken. It was 24/7 attack on my inner self, the same inner self that feels a sense of loss. So I went off and I left our marriage, and not with the intention that it would be permanent, but more as a wake-up call, hopefully, to create some change in behavior. Sadly, that didn't work out to be the case. And then it became a sense of missing my children. I spent the majority of my time when I was at home with them. Often my wife had evening shift work or whatever, so it was the 2 kids and I, bathing, feeding, reading them and singing them to sleep and all that kind of great stuff. And just being there day to day. Living in a city now that's 90 minutes away for the last 5+ years, in those first couple of years, I intensely missed that day-to-day contact with the children, and also was having battles after a couple of years with my wife over when I would have access to see the children, and which actually is going on to this day. But anyway, about a couple of years ago, the business I had started was faltering financially. I was extremely worried about that. I was continuing to have feelings of guilt and being a bad father and all this type of thing. It got to the point we had to sell our matrimonial home, and that's when things really got bad with my wife over money, and didn't make accessing the children any easier, that's for sure. But we came through all that, and what I can remember back to is the years before the house sold, but after I left, where my youngest, my son, on a Sunday afternoon after being down for the weekend, which I always did, running down the porch of the house, bawling his eyes out because I was driving away for another week. And he always used to tell me that Fridays was his favorite day of the week because that's when I showed up, and Sundays he hated the most because that's when I left. Now he's much older now, so he doesn't go into crying fits and that sort of thing anymore, and thankfully the children are normal and stable, and they do have a fantastic mother, and I see them as often as I can. But nonetheless, it really wrenched at me from a guilt standpoint. And then losing our home. This was a property we had purchased long before we had the children, and I wanted to be buried in the backyard. That was the way I felt about it. I loved the house. It was, if you like, a rustic log cabin, a wood stove heating type of environment. Lots of trees around, a couple of acres of beautiful wilderness to look at out the back window. Very private, lots of potential, that type of thing. I really have associated that house with having a home and with having a family, a loving wife, raising children, having a dog, all of which at different stages we did have. And the loss of that house also ripped the heart and soul right out of me. And at this time I was working with a counselor. She was a social worker, and she told me, she said, what you're going through is grief. And I kind of looked at her like, well, no one's died. I mean, yeah, things are not going well financially or with being able to have my children around or repairing a marriage or whatever, but still, no one's died. And the way she explained it to me was really quite insightful, I thought. And it was simply, she said, stress builds up over time, and the loss of anything that you hold dear to you, even a dream, the dream of having, the old story, the nice house, the white picket fence, and the kids, and, the typical Leave It to Beaver kind of scenario. She said, you grew up with that in your head as an objective for your life, and this is what you always wanted, and now you've lost it all. And that is something that's hitting you extremely hard. So you need to accept that fact and basically go through the same grieving process anyone else would, if they were to have lost their spouse or what have you. So I spent many a week bawling my eyes out, blaming myself for it all. I think the worst of it was the final days leading up to the sale of our house, where everything was emptied out, and I can remember sitting on the bay window seat that overlooked the backyard where we had spent years of our time in the summer and sliding on the snow with the kids in the winter and all this other great stuff, and just screaming at the top of my voice, knowing full well that none of the neighbors could hear because it was such a large property. The house wasn't very big, but nonetheless, it was very quaint, if you like that sort of thing. And I cried and I cried and I begged God, why is this happening? And, this obviously was happening at the same time as my anxiety and my depression just running rampantly out of control. And so anyway, once I understood that it was grief that I was going through, the really key thing, and here's your tip for this episode, which I think is number 8, is you've got to acknowledge those feelings and allow yourself some level of forgiveness and let those feelings out. Particularly for men, I think it's changing in our society, but a lot of us guys feel like we are the breadwinners of the family. So when a business fails and there isn't enough money to buy the kids a new pair of skates or whatever, you feel really, really inadequate. You're scared about your future. Will anyone ever hire me again? And you get insecure about your skills. You know, am I worthy to get another job again? And then when you start to see all of the major building blocks of your life start to disappear, or you lose access to them, it's a hell that I wouldn't wish on anyone. So I took her advice, and rather than try to bury my feelings or over medicate myself or drink too much or whatever, I allowed those feelings to surface whenever they needed to surface. And yeah, I wasn't always at a time or a place where it was appropriate to share them with someone else or to scream my head off like I did at the house. But I allowed my time to let that dream die. The dream of the perfect family, the dream of the perfect home, and looked more forward rather than constantly looking at the past and regretting all of the places where I could say, oh, I was at fault here and here and here and here. And if I just had been smarter, I wouldn't have lost all this stuff. So that's the impact of grief. And I'm sure it's the same if you lose someone physically close to you, to a funeral, or a broken relationship, or whatever. It can be equally as devastating. And don't underestimate the amount of stress that it adds on to what you're already dealing with if you're predisposed to depression or anxiety. The key thing at the end of the day is recognize how you're feeling. Don't try to avoid it, as I've repeatedly said many times. Don't try to get away from it. Don't mull over it. Don't sit there and just focus on it and nothing else. But, however, you do need to give yourself time and give yourself a pat on the back that whatever it is that you lost, you did the best that you probably could do given the scenario at the time. None of us are, have a crystal ball and can anticipate what consequences may happen, even if it was something that we did ourselves that eventually led to the loss. So give yourself some credit. Give yourself some kindness, forgiveness, even if there's other parties involved and they don't. They're not you, and you can't control them, so don't worry about it. And cry if you need to, scream if you need to. If you have a friend that you can, that doesn't mind being told the same sob story over and over again, so you do feel, that they are available to you, then certainly take advantage of that. There are lots of outlets for this type of thing, but it's not easy, and especially if you're predisposed to mental illness, this can be the type of thing that pushes you right over the edge. So you need to recognize it, and that's why I've created this one episode dedicated to the role that grief can play. So again, your tip is to acknowledge those feelings, see them for what they are, allow them to exist, don't try to push them away, let it out, and just give yourself time. And eventually you will come through it. And I have. I don't know if I'll ever own a house again. I'm not sure when I'm ever going to get hired for another job. No, I don't see my kids every single weekend as I'd like to. But you know what? I'm a damn good father, as best I can be under the circumstances. I provide as well as I can, and always act from a place of a personal integrity as to what I feel is important in life. No, I'm not cured of anxiety and nor depression. I still get down and that sort of thing, but at least I don't have that added stress of the grief on top of me. And it's been a couple of years now since that really peaked. So there you are, episode 8, the role that grief plays with anxiety and depression. So thank you very much for your time. I would appreciate any subscriptions if you'd like to click the subscribe button or like or dislike, and in particular any comments that you've got if any of these videos have been helpful to you. I certainly would appreciate knowing. Anyway, as always, you have a fantastic day. Take care.